thank my colleague from Colorado. I won't tell him what I was doing in 1986, the last time we adjusted this tax rate, but I just want to remind our colleagues today that we're in a moment of crisis in the United States. Today, we have a national debt crisis. I've been to this floor many times, many of you have as well, to talk about this debt crisis. It affects our ability to do the things that we know are right to do, to deal with the victims of hurricanes, to deal with the national security, to deal with our healthcare situation. But folks, we're losing the right to do the right thing. To solve this national debt crisis, we have to do many things. But one of the ways that we can deal with this debt crisis, and one of the first things we have to do, is to grow our economy. The way to grow the economy is to roll back regulations, unleash our energy potential, and yes, finally, once and for all, fix this archaic tax system that keeps us from being competitive with the rest of the world. In 1986, we had the third lowest corporate tax rate in history in the world. And over the next 15 years, we benefited from that. But at the same time, the more our economy grew, the lower tax rates were taken in the rest of the world. Today, American businesses are taxed at one of the highest rates in the developed world, 35%. Meanwhile, Japan, for example, statutory corporate rate is just 23%, Mr. President. Germany is at 16%, Mexico is at 30%, and the UK reduced theirs in 2009 from 30% to 19%, and they're about to go to 17% as we speak. The average rate, as a matter of fact, in Europe is just 18%, while in Asia, the average corporate tax rate is 20%. Now, why is corporate tax rate so important to an American worker? The corporate tax rate that we have in America is the greatest burden the American worker has today. Why? Because it makes the American corporation less competitive with the rest of the world. It also makes that American corporation vulnerable to foreign acquisitions of U.S. companies, and then the moving of those headquarters and factories and jobs offshore. The number one thing we can do for the American worker, Mr. President, is to become competitive from a tax standpoint with the rest of the world. I've lived this. I lived in Asia. I lived in Europe. I've worked here most of my career. And I know when this gets out of balance, and it's out of balance today, and we're penalizing the American worker because of it. It's no secret a lower corporate tax rate would make us more competitive globally. Our tax plan, as a matter of fact, fixes this. We're one of the last countries that still has a tax on unrepatriated earnings. In other words, if we have a U.S. company and it makes money overseas, it pays tax over there, we bring it back over here, we have to pay tax here. That double taxation, Mr. President, we're the last country in the world that really does that. We need to end that repatriation tax so that we can free up almost $3 trillion of U.S. profits overseas and bring them back and invest in training, in plants, in facilities, and in research and development. Our plan makes that happen. We have an individual tax code, Mr. President, that's 2.4 million words in length. Let me say that again. 2.4 million words in length. Wasn't the name of the 1986 tax law? Wasn't that the Tax Simplification Law of 1986? I think it was. 2.4 million words in length. That's ridiculous. And it's entirely too complex. We all know that. Our plan will fix this. It's estimated also that this tax plan, if we can get it enacted, will create over 1 million new jobs because of the changes that we are developing into this tax code change right now. It's estimated that in addition to that, the GDP growth will be more like 3.7% instead of the 1.9% we got used to over the last 8 years. And I believe, frankly, there's no reason why it can't be significantly more. We're getting closer to getting this done, but I realize there's a lot more to do, Mr. President. It's more important now than ever that we don't get bogged down in this Washington dysfunction in gridlock. Last week, I mentioned that many Democrats supported the changes that we're talking about in the tax code right up until President Trump took office. In fact, over the last several years, over the last several decades, many people on the other side of the aisle and people in their place before, Democrats in our country, agreed. This is not a partisan issue, Mr. President. This is about national security, if you want to get right down to it. It's about making America competitive again. Who would be against that? There are decades of quotes, Mr. President, from Democrats and Republicans about this issue. This should be a bipartisan issue. In 1963, a very famous American made this quote: "A tax cut means higher family income. and higher business profits and a balanced federal budget. In 1963, every taxpayer and his family will have more money left over after taxes. Every businessman can keep a higher percentage of his or her profits in his or her cash register to put it to work expanding or improving his business. And as the national income grows, the federal government will ultimately end up with more revenues. Now, that noted American was President John F. Kennedy in 1963. If he were here today, I think he would admonish all of us to put our partisan bickering aside and get something like this done for the American people. Another quote, and I quote, "I think the corporate rate should be lowered. We should try to get it as close to the international average as we can so we will once and for all be competitive." Bill Clinton, last year, 2016. Another quote, and I quote, "Get rid of the loopholes, level the playing field, and use the savings to lower the corporate tax rate for the first time in 25 years. President Barack Obama in 2011, believe it or not. This is not a partisan issue. There are more minority party leaders in the House and the Senate that have also come out and spoken on this point. I quote, "Today, 28 OECD countries and every other G7 country has adopted some form of territorial tax system. And all these countries have lower corporate tax rates than the United States. This means that no matter what jurisdiction a U.S. multinational company is competing in, they're competing at a disadvantage." That was current Senate Minority Leader in 2015. This is not a partisan issue. Another quote, and I quote, "It was long past time for tax reform that would lower the corporate tax rate," unquote. House Minority Leader Pelosi last year. This is not a partisan issue. This tax bill is being done under regular order, Mr. President, including a committee markup with plenty of amendments this week. It will go to the floor as soon as we can get it there for debate and more amendments. I urge all my colleagues, let's put partisan politics aside once and for all and collaborate through the amendment process to do something historic here, something that American workers deserve, and that is to become competitive with the rest of the world again. Renew your support for the same tax changes your party has supported for years. I want to close with another quote from an individual I've long admired, President John F. Kennedy in 1962. I repeat, our practical choice is not between a tax cut deficit and a budget surplus. It is between two kinds of deficits, a chronic deficit of inertia as the unwanted result of inadequate revenues and a restricted economy, or a temporary deficit of transition resulting from a tax cut designed to boost the economy, increase tax revenues, and achieve, I believe, and I believe this can be done, a budget surplus. The first type of deficit is a sign of waste and weakness. The second reflects an investment in the future. Again, words from President John F. Kennedy while he was president in 1962. Mr. President, this is not a partisan issue. Our tax plan is an investment in our future, just as John Kennedy said. It's an investment that will help all Americans. I know there's a lot of disinformation going on in this president. This is only a tax break for the wealthy and so forth. When the facts come out, and that's already come out, there are 4 Pinocchios been given to those comments. Our tax plan will prove that if we get into the details. Equally important of getting this tax plan done to help all Americans, it's a critical part of developing a long-term plan to solve this national debt crisis. Mr. President, I'm proud to serve here with my colleague from North Carolina, Senator Tillis. I think in North Carolina they actually did this, and they had the results that we're talking about here.